Of all, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we stand, which in my case is the Eora Nation of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us today. So my name is Guy Marks. I'm a respiratory physician and an epidemiologist. I'm based at the University of New South Wales in Sydney and the Woolcock Institute. And I am the principal investigator in the in CAR. CAR is now been operating in one form or another for about 8 or 9 years. We are a Centre of Research Excellence funded by the National Health and Medical Research Council, and we have this vision for a cleaner, a healthier community through cleaner air and cleaner energy sources. As a Centre of Research Excellence, we have these major modes of operation. One is through promoting research or the generation of knowledge through research. The second is by increasing research capacity. And the third, which is really what today's activity is around seeing evidence from research translated into policy and practice. We also, as a part of this, have a responsibility and a mission for building national and international collaborative partnerships. And many of the CAR investigators who you'll see here today are from around Australia, from several different research institutes and organisations around Australia. So the translation of research, both our own research evidence and that other people do, is a major theme of our mission, and that is really what today is about. Is there a next slide, Anna, or is
no? That's it, Guy. Thank you.
Okay, all right. So, okay, good. So then, so what I'm going to do today is we have the responsibility for that part of our work is in the hands of a research translation committee, and the co-chairs of that committee are Graham Zosky and Faye Johnston from University of Tasmania, and they are going to speak to you today about how this relates to our federal election priorities. So I'm going to hand over to Graham next, I believe, to take it from here. So thank you, Graham.
Thank you very much, Guy, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. So my name's Graham Zosky. I'm based at the University of Tasmania. I have a long history of an interest in the health effects of air pollution, and I've been working with the CAR in one way or another for many years. So I'm just going to take you through a brief introduction, a few slides around what we know about the health effects and the impact of exposure to air pollution, both from a health point of view and from an economical point of view. And then I'm going to run through some of the first few of our federal election priorities, and then hand over to Faye, who will talk about some of the others. So let's just briefly discuss or briefly cover the cost of air pollution in Australia. We know that the health impacts of air pollution in Australia are significant. And it's interesting to consider that because the prevailing sentiment is often that, well, relative to from international standards, Australia has fairly good air quality, therefore it's not an issue. And that's clearly not the case. So every year, exposure to one particular component of air pollution, which I'll describe in a minute, PM2.5, which are the very small particles suspended in the air, is associated with nearly 2,700 deaths and costs the economy over $6 billion. So clearly not an insignificant impact, both from a health point of view and from an economic point of view in the context of the Australian environment. So much of the priorities that we're going to talk about today are focused on one particular element of air pollution. Now, there are multiple elements of air pollution which we know have detrimental health effects, I'm just going to talk a little bit about PM2.5. And PM2.5 are the suspended particles in the air that are less than 2.5 microns in size. And at that size, they're able to bypass the upper airway and the natural filtration system that the human body has for filtering out particles and invading pathogens. Because they're small enough to bypass those natural defenses, they can reach the lungs. And because of their size, they can actually traverse the bloodstream as well. So there's some evidence that particles in this size range can traverse directly into the bloodstream, have effects around the body. And in fact, recent evidence suggests that those particles can traverse all the way from the bloodstream through the placenta and into the developing fetus as well. So there can be intergenerational effects from exposure to air pollution in early life. So this is the air pollutant that we know is likely to have the greatest impact on population health. It can travel deep into the lungs and can have multiple organ system effects. So what are the health consequences of exposure to PM2.5? Well, as you would anticipate, we know quite a lot about the respiratory health effects of exposure to PM2.5. So you inhale the particles, those particles come into direct contact with the cells in the lung, which includes cells in the immune system, and those cells have an adverse response to those particles. They recognize them as a threat and they behave accordingly. And it's that threat response that actually causes damage to the tissue and damage to the cells and causes the generation of disease or exacerbation of existing disease. As I mentioned before, we know that these particles are small enough to traverse the lungs and enter the bloodstream. So there are a range of effects on the heart and other disorders that we know are linked to impacts on the cardiovascular system, including diabetes, renal dysfunction. I mentioned before that we know that the particles can actually traverse the placenta and impact on the developing fetus, in addition to the indirect effects as a result of the adverse cellular response that the pregnant woman experiences. And recent evidence suggests that there's an association between exposure to PM2.5 and adverse cognitive decline and neurodegenerative diseases. So as you can see, the exposure to PM2.5, effectively, it has an impact on all systems in the body and has a range of adverse health outcomes associated with it. So it's a significant problem, even in the Australian context. So as Guy mentioned at the start, one of the key activities of the CAR Centre for Research Excellence is to engage with stakeholders in translation activities. With the looming federal election, we've taken this opportunity to identify 6 key areas where we think the greatest gains could be made in terms of improving air quality, which would then have flow-on effects for improving health and reducing the economic burden of exposure or of poor air quality. So I'll briefly summarise them here, and then I'll talk through the first couple in a bit more detail, and then hand over Faye to talk to the latter ones in some detail. So we have identified 6 priorities. The first one is around alignment of the national air quality standards with the recently released WHO air quality guidelines, and to ensure that this is underpinned by a change in the way that we treat air pollution in the Australian context towards a continuous emissions reduction framework as opposed to setting thresholds for air quality. I'll discuss that in more detail in a minute. It's important that any activity in this area is underpinned by strong legislation to ensure compliance with these air quality standards. And in the Australian context, we need to make sure that this is supported by an air quality monitoring network that's adequate to monitor exceedances or monitor situations where the air quality is poor. We know that wood heaters make a substantial impact on air quality. So we are advocating for strong national action to reduce the health burden related to emissions from wood heaters. We're also advocating to protect vulnerable individuals through the subsidisation of HEPA filter systems to protect individuals in situations where air quality is poor. Increased investment in and subsidisation to promote the uptake of electric vehicles, because we know electric vehicles will reduce the amount of PM2.5 in the environment. An accelerated reduction in emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels through the adoption of policies that incentivise renewable energy, and critically low emitting renewable energy sources, because not all renewable energy is good for health. So what we're going to do now is shift to talking about these priorities in a little bit more detail. And with a bit of luck, we'll have some time, question time at the end, where you can ask us some questions about some of the things we're going to discuss. So I'm just going to start with the first one, And our first key priority is alignment of the national air quality standards with the 2021 WHO air quality guidelines. And critically, that this is underpinned by a continuous emissions reduction framework. So what do we mean by this? You may or may not be aware that ambient air pollution in the Australian context is regulated by the Ambient Air Quality National Environmental Protection Measures. Those national environmental protection measures set a threshold or maximum concentration for 6 key criteria air pollutants. These exceedances are reported annually to the National Environmental Protection Council. And this system has several problems. The first is that it implies that there is a safe level of air pollution. And we know that this is not the case. You can detect health effects all the way down to 0. So any air pollution that's present in the environment will have a detectable effect on health. We also know that the relationship between the dose of exposure and the health outcomes is the steepest at low concentrations. And what does that mean in the Australian context? Well, I mentioned before that the sort of prevailing attitude is that the Australian air quality is relatively good compared to the international context, and that is true. But we also know that there are significant impacts both in terms of health and the economic burden. We also know that the greatest gains in terms of health are to be made at those low concentrations. So changes in policy that will improve air quality will have a significant impact on those numbers that I talked about before, the 2,700 annual deaths and the $6 billion cost to the economy every year. So using these thresholds implies that there's a safe level of air pollution. The evidence clearly shows that that's not the case. We know that there is no safe level. And in addition to this, for most pollutants, the National Environmental Protection Measure thresholds are higher than those set by the WHO. So not only are we behind the rest of the world in terms of having what would be considered a strategy to continually reduce air pollution, by setting these thresholds, we are setting ourselves behind the rest of the world, but also these thresholds are higher than what the WHO has set. So there are 2 issues here. So just to highlight this in a little bit more detail, on the left-hand side, we have the 6 criteria air pollutants. We have the National Environmental Protection Measure standards and the WHO air quality guidelines. Now, without going into any great detail about what these numbers mean, in simple terms, you can see that the bulk of these are higher. The threshold is higher for the National Environmental Protection Measures in Australia than they are for the WHO guidelines. So at the very least, we should be aiming to shift the thresholds to this point. As I mentioned before, and so this is just to highlight the fact that we know that PM 2.5 is a critical one, and the NEPM is almost double that of the WHO threshold. So at a minimum, what we're asking the government to do is to align our NEPM standards with the 2021 guidelines, but this is only the start. It's critical that we establish a policy framework that aims to continuously reduce population's exposure to air pollutants. And this is pretty much what's done everywhere else in the world. So rather than set thresholds, there should be targets for reductions in air pollution. And we know that any gains, even at the relatively low background concentrations that are in Australia, will have significant impact in terms of improving health and reducing the economic burden of exposure to poor air quality. So that's our first priority. The second priority is related to that. So one of the critical problems with the NEPM is the fact that there is in fact no framework for ensuring that a jurisdiction maintains their levels below the NEPMs. In other words, if a jurisdiction exceeds the NEPM for a year, for example, their PM 2.5 levels are higher than the NEPM threshold, there is no consequence for that. And we know that the large jurisdictions regularly exceed those thresholds. So it's critical that there's a strong enforcement and compliance mechanism for both ambient air pollution and point source air pollution, supported by an air quality monitoring network that's sufficient to accurately monitor those levels. So as I mentioned, the states and territories are held accountable for meeting NEPM simply by reporting it. But it can take years for those reports to become publicly available, and there's no action if those reports identify a situation of worsening air pollution, which seems, for want of a better word, slightly crazy. Why would you have a threshold and then not enforce it? The other issue that we have is, and partly it's an issue with the Australian geography, is that air quality is only measured at a very small number of official air quality monitoring stations. And the numbers of these are low and the spread is limited. So they don't often capture key areas of poor air quality, particularly around areas where there is high emissions from particular sources that emit high levels, but don't necessarily change the overall ambient air pollution for a large jurisdiction. So what are we asking? We're asking that there is a comprehensive suite of actions when air quality is worsening in a given location, or those NEPM standards are not being met. That there is provision of resources to local governments to identify and rectify excessive point source air pollution, and provide air quality trends and compliance data in an accessible and timely way so that there's some scrutiny around it. We also need to increase the coverage of a validated air quality monitoring network around Australia to support these jurisdictions to work towards continual reduction in emissions, as we described in our first point. So thank you for that. Hopefully I've covered a few interesting or helpful things. So a background around the health effects and the economic burden of air pollution, particularly PM2.5, and two key things that we need to do around standards and monitoring that will improve the health and well-being of all Australians and reduce the economic burden of poor air quality. So I'm now going to pass over to Faye, who's going to talk about the remaining federal election priorities.
Thanks very much, Graham, and hi everyone, and thank you very much for coming. I'm going to go through the remainder of our list, starting and just some preliminary comments, starting with wood heaters. And wood heaters are really interesting. I personally love wood heaters and the ambience that comes with wood heaters. They've potentially got a lot going for them in terms of being a renewable energy resource. And, you know, they're more common in country areas than in city areas. A lot of people will be wondering why we see wood heaters as such a high priority. And that's what I want to explain to you now and explain what we think the government should be doing. So the reason is, and this might be counterintuitive, but it really is the major contributor to air pollution in Australia in urban, regional and rural communities. Because wood heaters are able, one single wood heater is able to put out an awful lot of air pollution, and wood heaters are dispersed right where people live and where people breathe the air. And we've got two figures for you here from the Sydney Greater Metropolitan Region and Melbourne Metropolitan Region. So that Australia's two biggest cities, showing the emissions into the air from different sources. And in both figures, you can see on the left there for Sydney, coming from the New South Wales Clean Air Strategy, that big bar is residential wood heating, the #1 emissions of PM2.5 into the atmosphere for that region. And then on the bottom right, from the emissions inventory for Victoria, Melbourne Metropolitan, it's ranked the top 3 there. And again, wood heaters come out top. Motor vehicles second, aircraft third. Okay, power stations are mostly in the Latrobe Valley in Victoria, so they're less of an issue for Melbourne Metropolitan. But wood heaters punch well above their weight when it comes to putting harmful particles into the atmosphere. More so, particularly when you think that in Sydney and Melbourne, these big cities, it's only about 5% of households that have a wood heater. They're really able to put more pollution into the air than the vehicle fleet. And you think most households have 1, possibly 2 vehicles. So that just shows the contrast in the ability to pollute the air. And you can then take the different sources of particles in the air, and this study's been done by researchers and collaborators, figure out how much comes from different sources and then translate that into health impacts, because we know the relationship between PM2.5 and death and illness in the community really well established. So this is a study we're quoting from, showing an estimate, a modelled estimate using what we know of the health effects of particulate matter, and estimating the earlier than expected deaths from air pollution by source. And you can see that wood heaters top the list. Okay, so the estimate for Sydney is about 100 deaths each year attributable to the pollution that comes from wood heaters, and that exceeds the estimates for deaths attributable to power station emissions and vehicle emissions. So again, an example of how much wood heaters influence our health, even though they're not really forefront of our mind and they're seasonal. So the other point about them, their attributes are well known and understood, but the knowledge about the harms that go with them is less well understood across the community. And the technical ability to maintain a heater in a non-polluting way is actually really hard. So even with a modern Australian wood heater to the latest standards, it's still possible to put out way, huge amounts of smoke from that heater. So standards have tightened in recent years, but there are three key reasons that this is unlikely to improve air quality. And there's no, and I'd love to be proved wrong here, but there is no good scientific study published anywhere that has shown that our years of working to tighten standards have improved community air quality in any setting in Australia or globally for that matter. Other action is required. And the reason standards don't work is firstly, they don't reflect real world operation. They're really good for standardising between heaters. It's hard to standardise a test of a burn, but they don't, for example, include the startup stage. They include the efficient burning stage, but the vast amount of pollution that comes from wood heaters actually comes out in the startup stage. So you're not working with that, and startup is hugely user dependent. So there's a mismatch between the pollution and generation and the bit we test for the standards. It's really hard to enforce the standards. There was an audit done more than a decade ago of heaters sold in stores, and it was actually quite shocking. That was a government audit, how many did not even comply with the standards they were being sold to. And the other issue, of course, they last for ages. So even if we did change to a standard that included startup, that was way more stringent, that's not going to change air quality for decades unless we have a change out scheme for better heaters or non-polluting heaters.
We just let us interrupt you for a second, please. There's somebody who's not muted. Could I just ask that person to mute? Thanks. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks. Next slide, Graham. Okay, so what are we asking the government to do? And really, we're asking for leadership and strong national policy here. It is the single, Graham showed you the estimate of 2,700 deaths per year. I've shown you the #1 contributor for vast majority of areas of Australia. This is one area we can have quite a rapid win if we put our minds to it and reduce deaths. And of course, deaths are a part of it. Illness associated with air pollution is probably an order of magnitude bigger. And wood heaters is one area where we can have very rapid gains. So this would include compliance and enforcement mechanisms. We kind of have them. A lot of it gets sheeted home to local governments. Local governments have an awful lot on their plate without adequate resourcing to address this issue. So resourcing, training, the ability to enforce the laws about, the laws are under nuisance, not health and death for wood smoke. That in itself is inappropriate. Having local governments going out at night trying to figure out or prove beyond reasonable doubt that a chimney smoked for more than 20 minutes or, these vary jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It's very difficult. So compliance with standards, compliance with local pollution. And really the most important thing is a national fund to incentivise replacement of wood heaters with low polluting, ideally reverse cycle air conditioners, and in conjunction with other housing, insulation and other factors we know that are important for health and important for reducing air pollution. The last time we had a national leadership in this was back when John Howard was Prime Minister. And there was actually a great example in Launceston, and lives were saved because of support federally for the local and state governments to do something for a problem. That needs to be set up Australia-wide. If we have standards, they need to be more stringent and they need to reflect real world operation. We know this can be done. There's a great model in New Zealand. There is no reason why we can't have more appropriate standards in Australia. And the other thing we're calling for is a central register. There's been efforts towards this, but really for other dangerous polluting things like cars, nobody objects to a central register. We know our car fleet, we know how old it is, we know the laws about emissions. we don't know any of this for wood heaters. If we want to take serious action on wood heaters, we need to know where they are, how old they are, and how we're going with our efforts to reduce the pollution that comes from them. And then finally, to support all this, we need much better information going to the public of the full spectrum of the impacts of wood heaters and what we can do to reduce their health effects. Okay, and I'm just checking the time here. So moving on from sources of pollution to how do we protect vulnerable people? We know we need to work on reducing emissions and reducing the harm, but we know we can't do that immediately. And there is one, and it's probably the only one with really high level evidence that reduces people exposure and improves their health. And that is to be able to set up a small clean air shelter in their own home, in a bedroom with a HEPA filter. Particles penetrate very quickly. They're a bit like a gas. Closing the doors will work for a certain amount of time. But in Australia, we have lots of serious sources of pollution, bushfires, planned burns, smoky wood heater neighbourhoods. You're not going to be able to keep that smoke out of your home. The only way proven with good evidence to protect yourself is to have a HEPA filter. And they've got additional benefits because they'll also deal with indoor particle sources, not gases, particles is what they do, and biological particles, viruses, fungi and bacteria, but they're expensive. So we are calling, if we go to the next slide, for subsidy because for people of low means. We do this for medications, for statins, for example, for heart disease. We probably subsidise high-risk people of low income to quite a few $100s a year to get a medication to protect their heart. A HEPA filter can cost between $300 and $800. A subsidy scheme there would be really cost-effective for those of low means who are at very high risk. And the people at high risk, there's a lot of groups, but people at very high risk of a heart attack, people very old, young or pregnant, may have no other means available to them to protect themselves when there's a lot of, or even a moderate amount of outdoor particulate matter. Thanks, Graham. Yeah. Okay, so the final two relate to really to the nexus between climate change and air pollution. So action taken on climate change to reduce fossil fuel combustion, which I'll talk about in a moment. One of the key ways we can do that is changing the vehicle fleet to electric. Not only does that help us with climate change, it reduces the amount of pollution. I showed you a slide earlier, wood heaters were number one, the vehicle fleet was number two in terms of sources of air pollution in the community. So we need to accelerate this change. There's high cost and there's not a lot of infrastructure. A lot of jurisdictions are working on this. National leadership can really accelerate this and benefit all Australians. It will help with climate change. It will help with population health. So that's what we're asking the government to do. Policies to purchase, maintain and easily charge electric vehicles. Thanks, Graham. Okay, and finally, in a way, the most obvious of them all, accelerated reduction of emissions from combustion of fossil fuels and adoption of policies to... Sorry, there's someone talking. Would you kindly mute? Okay, I'll go on. So we know burning fossil fuels has direct and indirect effects on air quality, and we know it produces particulate matter. I've shown you that, Graham's shown you that a few times. We also know that it increases along when you burn fossil fuels, you'll get greenhouse gases, you'll get air pollution. The greenhouse gases are fueling climate change. Climate change is fueling extreme events. We're having unprecedented events every day of the week from the emissions into our atmosphere. That's happening right now. It's inbuilt. It's going to get worse in the next decades, regardless of what we do. This is really urgent. The extreme events include bushfires. Bushfires, of course, are one of the biggest emitters of air quality. We've all experienced this. We're going to keep experiencing this. So to manage extreme events, to manage air quality, and to manage a safe future, for all these reasons, action on climate change and moving towards renewable non-emitting sources, ideally wind and solar, is an urgent priority where national leadership is crucial. So introduce legislation to accelerate the reduction of emissions from burning fossil fuels, divest in high emitting sources like coal and gas urgently, and invest in cleaner sources like wind and solar. Thank you. That comes to the end of what CAR sees as the priorities for the next government. I think we do have some moments if people would like to type in questions into the chat. I might hand to you, Graham, to facilitate that part.
Yeah, sure. Happy to, Faye. And I did notice there was a few questions that I could probably answer that had come into the chat, and so I apologise. I couldn't. I was trying to keep an eye on slides and various other things. And so thank you to those also CAR members who've answered some of the questions as we've gone along. So I'm just going to quickly scroll through. And of course, if you, we could also put your hand up in the participant section. I'll try and monitor that as well. We have had a few questions, which is fantastic. And so I'm just going to quickly scroll down and make sure that most of them have been answered. So there were some questions early on about the WHO guidelines and the fact that they were only released recently. And as Guy's pointed out, the mechanisms for changing the NEPMs in Australia are incredibly slow and move at a glacial pace. If you actually go back and look at the original proposals to alter the NEPMs for PM 2.5 around 10 years ago, people were advocating for a continual reduction framework then. And in fact, some members of what is currently CAR had written position papers around that at the time. So this is something that's been on the table for a very long time. These things move very slowly. It took many years for the PM 2.5 threshold to even exist. Before that, it was a guideline as opposed to being one of the criteria air pollutants. So the systems clearly don't work fast enough. And so we need to do something about that now. So there's things about WHO. So I'm just playing catch up. So a question here around wood smoke that you actually kind of addressed in what you said, Faye. There was a question around the will and the capacity in local governments, and you addressed that. And it's clearly a resourcing issue, and we acknowledge that. And there was a question from Nathan. This is probably sits a bit in my wheelhouse around the different chemical compositions of PM and how that contributes to health outcomes. I think that the take-home message is simple. Irrespective of the source of PM, there's a correlation between dose and health effects, and there's no PM source where there are no health effects associated with it. We do know that different chemical components of different kinds of PM, so for example, for a dust storm versus emissions from wood heater, will have different cellular effects, and therefore the range of potential health effects are different, but there are still health effects, if that makes sense. So there are health effects irrespective of the source of the PM 2.5. There may be subtle differences in the kinds of health effects, but they will still be respiratory, they'll still be cardiovascular. So there is enough evidence to show out there to show that some different kinds of particulates have different health effects, but the broad summary is that at a population level, there is a relationship between PM 2.5 from any source and adverse health effects. So I'm just trying to play catch up here. There's some comments about, there's a question here, Faye, that you might be able to answer. Interested to know why wood heater buyback schemes would be advocated for before trying pollution control first, filtration, catalysts, and so on. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, sure. So I'm not quite sure what we've got thousands upon thousands of heaters throughout the community, and the technology for adding filtration and catalyzed combustion to those heaters isn't there. That's a major retrofit, a major effort to change that. It's much more logical to move to low polluting. And if we can achieve a low polluting wood heater through catalyzed combustion, for example, that is foolproof, that is not going to pollute, even if the owner is not good at understanding the details of combustion and efficiency, then that would be fine. But the technology isn't there at this point in Australia. The heaters aren't there at this point in Australia. And we need to do it now. We need to work with the stock that's out there in the community polluting the air right now, as well as, I think there is room for technology going forward, but we've got to deal with the problem that's out there right now.
There's another question here that I also think it's in your wheelhouse, Faye. I know this is an area you're interested in. There's a comment here about state air quality guidelines. And the comment is New South Wales air quality guidelines list 10 micrograms per cubic metre as good, which is misleading even by the old guidelines. I don't know if you want to comment on, in a position to comment on that.
Yes, so, and this is a really interesting and really important point. The Australian standards are based on 24-hour averages. After the bushfires, because people needed to know what was going on in real time, jurisdictions agreed to provide close to real-time information to enable people to manage their exposure to air quality. And I agree, 10 is not good. Even at an hour, it's well above background, and we know that every rise above background is harmful. So if you're in an area, a wood smoke affected area, for example, you could have air pollution, 5 or 10 or 15 or even 20 above background for months, sometimes, certainly weeks. And if you're only showing an hourly guideline that's set higher than the 24-hour standards, you will be constantly told your air quality is good where it's not, where it's doing harm. And my view is that nationally we have more work to do in getting that right. That's showing the hourlies, they're not tied to a standard, it's for people to manage their health. Categorising those to enable people to protect their health was a recent thing after the bushfires. I mean, some states, and I'll promote Tasmania here, had been doing it for a decade, but because that's a new policy, there's still work to do to get that better. People need to know when the air quality has departed from what they usually live with, because that's important.
Thanks, Faye. It's a comment from Nick, which is actually a fair and good point. It's that if we switched to, say, reverse cycle air conditioning from wood heaters, the bulk of the network currently runs on coal power, and that would take a long time to get to renewable emissions. But would I be correct in saying that there would still be a net benefit because the wood heaters are such a high polluter as opposed to the generations of emissions? Is that a fair comment, Faye?
Absolutely. It will reduce the pollution people are breathing right now because it's such a bigger source of air pollution. But of course, we need to get off coal and we need to get renewable sources of electricity.
Thanks, Faye. More positive comments about switching to renewables, which you've just mentioned. So there's this comment here, and I suppose it's a comment, not really a question, about the fact that the WHO is quite specific about the phase out of coal. While the energy transition is happening here, it's not really, necessarily driven by such a robust policy. I don't know if you have any comments on that, Faye, other than the more policy we have around that, the better, and a clear trajectory towards phasing out those emissions would be good. Yeah. Thank you, Michael. Has made a good suggestion that I've only just got to, which is suggest unsharing the screen. That's a great suggestion. Thank you. So there's a question here, and perhaps you can comment on this in the context of the Latrobe Valley, Faye. Has there been a study done beyond the greater metropolitan region, given that pollution from coal power stations, doesn't often sit in those spaces? And I don't know whether you want to comment around that.
Yes, so there's been a lot of studies looking at source apportionment in major population areas, and the question here is about what about small communities, and there is an issue of environmental justice, really, of where people live and where people can afford to live and the quality of the air they breathe, and that's really important in rural communities. Latrobe Valley I have a particular interest in because I'm part of the Hazelwood Health Study, which is following the health of adults and children in that community since a serious fire in the mine. So that's a community that's had power stations and pollution from just the coal fire stations, and then on top of that had serious pollution from like for weeks on end from this coal mine fire. And in regard to that, the pollution in the air in the Latrobe Valley is actually similar and on some criteria slightly better to Melbourne metropolitan. So there's a greater proportion that comes from the power stations. There's actually a slightly lower proportion that comes from vehicles. And really with particulate matter and air pollution, it all adds up. It all contributes to our health, and we need to work on all of it. And in some regions, you know, some sources are going to be more important than others, but we do need to work on all of it. Emissions from the, you know, industrial stacks, emissions from the vehicle fleet, emissions from heaters, and then more broadly with landscape fires, how we manage the fires we choose to light and put smoke into the air, which is important for bushfire control, and how we protect the populations where we have no control over with severe wildfires, over pollution in the air. It all works together, and every increment of that we make improves. That's the wonderful thing about air pollution. The corollary of no safe level is that every tiny step forward we make, we improve our health, we reduce death rates. Even a small increment will have a big health effect. The cost effectiveness of doing these things is huge. So it's worth not giving up on any front.
Thanks. So there's a great question here from Tanya, which is actually a conversation piece that comes up around electric vehicles, and I'm probably in a position to answer this quite often, is the fact that there is some evidence that electric vehicles, because of they're often heavier, that there's an increase in particles generated by tyre wear and by brakes and so on. And that is true, but again, it's a little bit like the argument around switching wood heaters to air conditioners that are driven by coal-fired power. The net effect, yes, there are still particles emitted by electric vehicles, but the net effect would still be a reduction in the overall particulate matter, and that's what we're interested in. But it is, of course, important to understand the full life cycle of an electric vehicle. Obviously, the power to charge it has to come from somewhere, and it's critical that we move towards low-emitting renewable sources to drive that. But overall, the introduction of electric vehicles in other areas around the world has clearly shown that there's a reduction in the overall emissions. So just moving down our list here. So there's a question, a point here from Dorothy. I don't know whether you're in a position to comment on this one, Faye. It's around wood heaters again, around an interim measure being the development of a new standard based on health criteria, but also to demonstrate that the current models, new and older, are currently also causing a problem. So there's still, you're probably in a better position to comment on that one.
Yeah, so the health impacts of emissions from wood heaters do need to be front and central of any standards, because that's the harm they cause. That's what's you know, we need to protect the community. So I totally agree with that. Our priority on replacing wood heaters is something we can do immediately. Anything with standards takes forever. So I agree with that, and I guess I'm saying that alone isn't sufficient. We need to do a lot more, and I know that Dorothy will agree with that.
There's a great question here from Sharon. I think it is about pollution from idling cars in local areas around schools and what is the impact. And I suppose this actually speaks to our point of, you know, understanding local areas where there's poor air quality and having a better monitoring of such situations too, but also informing planning from a local council, local government point of view in terms of where you put collections of vulnerable individuals like schools and aged care homes and medical facilities in relation to areas where you might have collections of air pollution, for example, at you know, in heavy traffic areas or around traffic lights and so on. So that's a great point. In terms of how concerned should you be about this, that's a hard question to answer, because it kind of depends on the levels of air pollution that you're talking about. And there's I'm not aware of many studies. Are you aware of any, Faye, where they've tried to look at local emissions from, say, you know, being in proximity to a set of traffic lights or you know, high traffic areas near schools? I mean, we know that proximity to high traffic areas is associated with adverse outcomes. We absolutely know that. So, you know, the more that we can keep collections of vulnerable individuals further away from those situations, the better. But I'm not aware of specific studies that looked at idling cars near schools and so on. Are you?
Not of a specific study, but certainly spatial mapping, and not of a study that links it to health.
Yep.
Idling is a source of emissions. We need to continually reduce emissions, and the exposure to particulates through the day of the children and the parents, this is one contributor. It's one way you can reduce emissions. What shapes their overall health, of course, will depend on all the other exposures and all the other risk factors and level of physical activity and all the other things that shape health. So we're working where we can, and where we can, we should.
So there's some more comments here around public health, health messaging around wood heaters and education, and some comments around, EVs aren't emission free, and I think I addressed that earlier. There's an interesting comment about here about, could you have a policy that's a bit different around wood heaters where you charge users as opposed to subsidising the removal? And I mean, it's not my area of expertise. I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that, Faye, about what's the best way to incentivise behaviour. That's a very complex area.
Yeah, look, there's lots of possible models, and it's a case, and I think this is where we really need a good dialogue with our community, with our councils, because there are a lot of options. Registration, I happily, sat for my driver's license, I paid for that privilege, and, you have an education that goes with that, same with a motorboat license. And the purpose of that is to educate people who are in charge of this technology so they don't harm other people in the community. You could have an analogous system for wood heaters, but it would need to be introduced with dialogue, with, it has to work for everybody, for the community, for the councils. But I think there are a lot of ways we could change behaviour and reduce pollution and manage wood heaters. In addition, what we're proposing in these priorities is really where a federal government can really take leadership. I think there are lots of ways that local councils and state governments can also take leadership.
Thanks, Faye. There's actually a great topical question here from Nick about the contribution of heavy duty transport, like large trucks and that sort of thing. It's actually really topical at the moment. It's something that we've contributed to. There's kind of two elements to it. One element is around the quality of the fuel that's available in Australia and how that relates to the more stringent standards of diesel engines, for example, that are being developed are being legislated in Europe. So Australia is very far behind in terms of our legislation around the requirements for emissions from diesel cars compared to Europe. The problem is if you introduce that same legislation, we couldn't achieve it because the fuel quality in Australia is much poorer. There's been some recent movement in this space around the private vehicle fleet, but the heavy duty vehicle is treated separately. So it's an absolutely, I personally think it's an absolutely critical point that we should be looking at those sources of emissions and legislating them in the same direction as we are currently doing for private vehicle use, and do something rapidly to take the 10 steps needed to catch up to the rest of the world, because we're very far behind in that space. Questions? I'm conscious of the time and the fact that we probably won't get to everyone's questions. What we might do, Anna, if you're comfortable, is we might try and we'll get a copy of the chat, and we'll do our best to answer some offline questions as well. Of course, everyone is welcome to email the CAR address directly, and we do our best to answer any concerns or queries that people have around air pollution in the areas that we're experts in. So more than happy to field questions offline. I want to really thank everyone for their contribution today. Thanks for your time, Guy, for introducing us, and thanks, Faye, for the presentation. And thank you, everyone, for sitting through this and being so active in the chat. I think there's been some really great discussion. I think the message is clear. We need some strategies to reduce exposure to air pollution in the Australian context. There are some very simple things that can be done to get some really big gains in health and reduce the economic burden, which expands, as Faye mentioned, beyond mortality and to the effect on disease exacerbation and sickness and being away from work and so on. And so there's a lot of things that can be done very easily that will have a big impact in the Australian context. And we hope that these federal election priorities get someone takes some notice of them. I don't know if you want to add anything at the end, Faye.
No, well said, Graham. Just thank you so much. The discussion and the questions have been fantastic and the level of engagement. So thank you for joining the discussion, and we look forward to continuing it with all of you.
Any
Thanks.
parting comments, Guy?
I might just say thank you to both of you and to all of the people who've been involved in putting this together. Just to reiterate, you know, the context for this is the federal election. It is a very important part of the Australian political system and decision-making system. CAR itself has no particular political agenda, but our agenda is to see evidence translated into policy, and the federal election context is the one time every 3 years where we have a real opportunity to do that. And so I'd ask those people who are involved here to participate in that process, and our purpose for this session and for the document that we published is to try and put some priorities, the 10 priorities that we've listed there, as priorities for take up by the political process as a part of this election process. So I hope that this has contributed to that task, and we'll see the agenda for better air quality and health move forward as in Australia. So thank you very much again to everybody who's participated in this. All the best.
Thanks, Guy. I hope to see everyone again soon sometime.
Thanks.